Hi, 8th grade. This is our video presentation on the first lesson of Chapter 17, titled The Civil War. This is Lesson 1, which is titled The Two Sides. If you remember from the end of Chapter 16, Lesson 4 Lesson 3, titled Secession and War, we went ahead and left off by basically introducing the start of Lincoln's presidency, how he was faced with the challenge of sending troops over to Fort Sumter without causing any problems with the Confederate soldiers that were occupying the fort at the time. Of course, under the leadership of Jefferson Davis in the South, the Confederacy were the ones that started the attack. The Battle of Fort Sumter became the actually first official battle of the American Civil War. Civil War would take place over the next 4 years. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this quarter, the Civil War was going to be the last unit that we'd be talking about as an 8th grade social studies class. So this is the start of that chapter. This is Lesson 1, The Two Sides. So I want to go ahead and start off with a brief consideration question, okay? I want you to think about how a country is like a family. Okay, when comparing family and country, and you're doing something similar right now for the discussion board, the debate board, how a country is like a family, you might say that people share a government, just like children share parents. We see a government as kind of like the lawmaking, judicial, sort of power enforcing body, the same way that children, minors, dependents, so to say, might see their parents as the lawmaking body in their terms. And the same way that a country enforces laws, parents enforce rules in the house. Okay? And if you break a law, there's consequences. If you break one of the rules that your parents have set forth, guess what? There's also going to be consequences. It takes all the people in a nation working together to achieve success. Whether you are a citizen or you're a member of the state or you're a member of the federal government, it definitely takes the sense of cohesiveness to achieve what ideally is a successful country. Now, on the home terms, it takes families working together to achieve happiness. If you have your parents only deciding what makes them happy without the support of the children, you're not going to have a happy family. Similarly, if you just have total chaos with the children deciding whatever they want to do, yeah, that sounds fine and dandy and all, but hopefully you're old enough to acknowledge that that is also compromising that happiness. So it sort of takes a balance between both sides. So you can see that there's actually a lot of similarities between country and family. Okay? So then I ask you, what then can happen within families when they have strong disagreements? Okay? Disagreements between a family can actually go ahead and have some long-term issues on the young, especially on the descendants of that family. The disagreements, in this case now in country, that are going to take place between the North and the South, not just the ones that we talked about in Chapter 16, very basic feudal disagreements, but now we're talking about actual warfare. The disagreements that between the northern and southern states divided the country and even divided families. So we're going to see a whole lot of that in this lesson and throughout this whole chapter. Okay? So we have in the Civil War what we would like to refer as two very different sides. It's not just the North and the South, and not just the whole idea that theoretically one was wholeheartedly for slavery and the other side totally against slavery. There was a much larger gray area in between in that sense. A little bit of information about the Civil War, since this is the chapter entirely dedicated to that very important time period in American history. The Civil War began on April 12, 1861, and would not end until April 9th of 1865. This is almost exactly 4 full years of fighting, so historians actually rounded up to a 4 years war. Very, very bloody battle. Very bloody war, I'm sorry. No one could have foreseen that the 4 years of the Civil War would lead to so much suffering and division. One of the things we're going to talk about in this lesson actually is how both the North and the South thought that the Civil War was actually going to be something that would end very quickly. No one could have seen that it would last 4 years, totally unprecedented. It would lead to so much suffering and division. By the end of the war, that is by April of 1865, roughly 600,000 Americans had lost their lives. Thousands more were wounded in battle. Okay. So let's talk about the border states. For most states, choosing sides in the Civil War was an easy matter. If you were in the North, you were against slavery. If you were in the South, you were pretty much for slavery. Very simple like that. As I mentioned before, though, there was a gray area, and this gray area largely existed in what we called the border states. For border states, which were states literally on the border between the North and the South, that is, the states lying so close or practically on the 3630 line set forth by the Missouri Compromise, the choice between slavery or no slavery, even siding with the Union or siding with the Confederacy, left many people divided. In the particularly 4 states we're looking at here, 4 key border states. Those are the states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Fortunately for the South, in all 4 of those states, slavery did exist. However, benefit here that it did not exist as widespread as in the full Confederate states, those existing immediately in the South. Each of these 4 states did still have close ties to both the North and the South. So though they had slavery permitted in their territories, they still had a close relationship to maintain with both the North and the South. The border states were vital to the strategy of the Union. Missouri could control parts of the Mississippi River and therefore routes to the west. Kentucky controlled the Ohio River. Delaware was close to the key Union city of Philadelphia, and possibly most important of all, the state of Maryland. Maryland, which was, like I just said, possibly the most important of the 4 border states, was close to Richmond, the Confederate capital. Richmond, Virginia, that is, the capital of Virginia. Perhaps most significantly also, Washington, D.C. lay within the state of Maryland. So if Maryland seceded, the North's capital would be surrounded, potentially compromised, and may have had totally damaging effects on the sustainability of the Union. President Lincoln worked endlessly to keep the 4 border states within the Union. He's famous for writing in September of 1861, I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. We would as well consent to separation at once, including the surrender of this capital. In the end, Lincoln was successful. All border states remained in the Union. Several border state residents, however, did continue to support the Confederacy. The president had to work extra hard to restrain what he called opponents of war, these opponents of the war. So let's talk about each side's strengths and weaknesses. The 2 very different sides, strengths and weaknesses of being in the North and the Union, strengths and weaknesses of the South and the Confederacy. Each side to the war had advantages and disadvantages compared to the other side. Uses of these strengths and weaknesses would determine the war's outcome. The North did have a larger population and ultimately access to more resources. Remember, the North, you have a lot of harbors, you have a lot of factories, a lot of capability to manufacture goods that are essential for mobilizing in a war. The South, which is predominantly made up of farms, isn't going to have as much of a benefit in manufacturing, so less resources, also less of a population. That is less of a population that was not African American. Remember, at the time, unfortunately, the South is still seeing African Americans as property. So less of a legal population in those terms, I guess you can say. The South did, however, have a strong fighting spirit and excellent military leaders. Robert E. Lee, who we talked about near the end of chapter 16 last week, had an excellent fighting spirit, regarded as probably one of the most influential generals in that time period. Also, since most of the war was fought in the South, you have kind of like this home territory advantage, this home turf advantage given to Confederacy because they knew the land, and they didn't just know the land, they had the full intention of defending it. It was homeland to them. It was a matter of getting these Union people out of their property and defending their right to being considered an independent nation. So here's a brief a note slide. You can go ahead and take a screenshot of this. Just sums up the strengths and the weaknesses. We didn't talk too much about the weaknesses, but one side's strength could be seen as the other side's weakness. So while we said that the South's weakness was having less money and resources compared to the highly manufacturite North, the North's weakness could be the lack of knowledge of terrain in the South. Moving on to the goals of war. This is important to take note of. Both sides' goals, their end game, so to say. What did they want out of this war? Simply put, the Confederacy just wanted to become an independent nation. As we've talked about in the previous chapter, they did so. They managed to slowly become part of an independent country through this whole idea of secession, and by calling themselves the Confederate States of America. So they just wanted the Union to look at them as an independent nation. To do this, consider this, the South did not have to invade the North. They didn't have to go attacking anybody. They didn't even have to destroy the Union Army. They knew these things probably just could not happen. All the South needed to do, their only goal, was fighting hard enough and long enough to convince the North that the war was not worth its cost, for the North to give up and the South to get what it wanted, which was being regarded as an independent Confederate nation. The North, on the other hand, in contrast, contrast is a vocabulary word for this lesson, which means in comparison with respect to differences. In contrast, the North wanted to restore the Union. They needed to restore this idea of unification, this idea of being united. It's in our nation's name, the United States of America. So it's going to have to think a little bit differently than just, defending a belief or not destroying. Unfortunately, the Union's going to have to be a little more destructive in their ideas and carrying them out. Its forces had to invade the South and force breakaway states to give up their quest for independence. Although slavery divided Northerners and Southerners, President Lincoln's original aim was not to defeat slavery. He wrote in 1862, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So let's go ahead and now talk about a little bit about the strategies of each of these sides. Let's go ahead and start off with the Confederacy. The Confederacy had a basic strategy. Much like I said prior, they weren't into attacking. The Confederacy's mentality is to conduct a defensive war. This meant that it would hold as much territory as possible. Southerners felt that if they showed determination to be independent, that Northerners would eventually become tired of the war and, like I said, would just surrender to the Southerns' hope that they would be regarded as an independent country. The South also tried to win support from Great Britain and France. Very betrayalish here, very traitorous. For the South to turn around and ask Great Britain, who, as you know, probably last year from civics, we fought so hard against as a unified country in the Revolutionary War. So now for the South to turn around and say to Great Britain and France even, hey, we need your help to fend off the North. Yes, it is very traitorous and almost treasonous in that sense. So they tried to win support from Great Britain and France, and because these countries had a huge suffering in terms of their economics. Their economies had suffered when the war disrupted the export of southern cotton, which was a hugely important good in those countries. Southerners hoped that these countries might pressure the North to end the war, be able to go to the North and say, hey, we're suffering in our economy over here, try to end your war amongst yourselves. On to the strategies of the Union, which differ very much from the South. While the South is kind of heading things in a very defensive fashion, the North is going to develop an offensive war strategy. So the North's war plan came from General Winfield Scott. General Scott, very important, influential military hero of the Mexican-American War. He was publicly known. He knew that the North would have to defeat the South completely. There was no defensive strategy. It was just a matter of completely taking over the South and reclaiming the sustainability of the Union. So Scott proposed the so-called Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan took its name from breed of snake, the anaconda, which if you don't know much about anacondas, they're very popular in the Congo. Fortunately for us, not too popular around here in South Florida. But anacondas are known to squeeze their prey to death. So this name is actually pretty fittingly attributed to this plan. As it says here in this picture, it was a plan ideally to starve and to crush the South. Okay, so the Anaconda Plan is made up of pretty much 3 distinct parts. Okay, the first part of the Anaconda Plan was that the Union would blockade, meaning close, southern ports, block the ports, keeping supplies from reaching the Confederacy and preventing exports. If you prevent the South from exporting cotton, which was selling for huge prices in foreign countries, they wouldn't be able to get as much money, they wouldn't be able to get as many goods. This would definitely cut off their supply and ideally starve them. Secondly, the North would seek to gain control of the Mississippi River. If you look at this picture, here's the Mississippi right here, cutting pretty much straight in the middle of what was the Confederacy. So if the North would gain control of the Mississippi River, the Confederacy would pretty much be split into 2 parts and would actually end up also cutting Southern supply lines, considering that the Mississippi was such a huge part of transporting goods to different states throughout the Confederacy. Finally, third and last part of the Anaconda Plan, the North sought to capture Richmond, Virginia, not just the capital city of Virginia, but at the time, the Confederate capital. Here you have another study slide for the strategies that we've just talked about. Go ahead and take a screenshot. Strategies for winning the North, strategies for winning the war from both the North perspective and the South perspective. So this wraps up section 1, 2 very different sides. Here's your comp check question for the section. Why did the South use a defensive strategy instead of an offensive one? Give you a moment to take a look at that. Well, pretty much the South had fewer resources and could not attack the North, so it had to defend its territory from the North in order to become an independent country. On to section 2, which is titled Americans Against Americans. This is pretty much what the Civil War was. Americans pinned up against each other. Okay? The Civil War was more than just a war between the states. It wasn't just an ordinary war. Okay? And by saying Americans against Americans, we're talking about, like we said at the beginning of this lesson, division in families, division in politics, division in beliefs, division in pretty much everything. It turned brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, and not just saying this in a metaphorical sense, literally families torn apart due to their differing beliefs in terms of slavery. In defense of slavery, the South was willing to go ahead and do anything. Pretty much the North at the same time would do anything to defend their beliefs against slavery. So this definitely divided lots of families. 2 of these instances of a division of family. First instance is in the case of Kentucky Senator John Crittenden that we talked about last lesson, I believe, in chapter 16. Crittenden had 2 sons who became generals in the time of the Civil War. However, one of those sons who became a general fought for the Confederacy and the other one for the Union. So literally, you have a brother against a brother in this case. And then even First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln, who was President Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln had relatives in the Confederate Army. So being the wife of the President of the United States, the leader of the Union, her own family members consisted of several members that were part of the Confederacy. Men of all ages rushed to enlist. Enlist is another vocabulary term which means to join. Rushed to enlist the Union or Confederate Army. Everybody wanted to be a part of the war at the time. Some did so out of patriotism, the strong belief that they should defend their country, whether it was the Union or the newly developed Confederate States of America. They had this sense of patriotism in defending their idea of a country. Okay, so some did so out of patriotism, and others thought that they would be called cowards if they did not serve. And still, even others simply joined the war because they were looking for excitement. Again, a lot of people thought that the Civil War was just going to be this very quick, very short military outing, very short war. Nobody could have predicted that it would last 4 years and would be as dangerous and as costly in terms of casualties until the end of it all. Though the average Civil War soldier was in his mid-20s, many recruits on both sides were hardly even adults. Tens of thousands of soldiers were under the age of 18, some of them even younger than 14. To get into the army, many teenagers ran away from home or lied about their ages. You can see here a picture of what appears to be a very young boy who actually was credited by Life magazine as being one of the most influential soldiers, actually, during the Civil War. So I'll be able to send you an article about him, actually, on a separate occasion to you guys on Classcraft. Okay. Although teenage boys were accepted into service, one group of men was not allowed to fight in the early days of the war, and those were African Americans. Unfortunately, African Americans in the early days of the Civil War, on either side, the North and the South, were not allowed to fight in the Civil War. Why would the Union not allow African Americans to serve in the war if they were so against slavery and respecting African Americans? Well, the Union refused at first to let free African Americans enlist, and their idea was that white troops would not accept African American soldiers. They were worried that their white troops in their army would not accept them and would cause internal issues within the Union Army. Later on in the war, however, the Union Army did change this policy and went ahead and started enlisting free African American men into their army. Confederacy, on the other hand, refused to even consider having African Americans fight up until the very last final desperate days of the Civil War. Their belief, predominantly that African Americans were considered property, but even considering that not so much the property perspective anymore, simply put, the South did not want to give enslaved people weapons. Again, this whole idea, this fear of insurrection, of African Americans turning against their own side in the Confederacy would ultimately just destroy the Confederate Army within itself. So here's a little slide giving us more information about African Americans in the Civil War. It says here roughly 180,000 soldiers of African descent served in the Union Army during the Civil War. Official enlistment of African Americans did not begin until after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1862. This was because most white military officials believed that African Americans would not make good soldiers. The Negro regiments, as the regiments of African Americans were called, proved the white military officials wrong. Highly effective and courageous African American soldiers made up 10% of the Union Army by the end of the war. Unfortunately, nearly a fifth, 20% of African American soldiers lost their lives for the Union cause during the Civil War. So as I mentioned before, when the war began, each side thought that this was just going to be a quick victory. Okay, they had high hopes that this was just going to be a very short war. In the North, Northerners couldn't imagine the Confederates holding out for long against the Union's greater resources. Meanwhile, the Southerners, the Confederates, believed that the North could never subdue the fighting spirit of the South. So this dualistic idea of both sides believing that they had a greater advantage, that they were going to have a swift victory, this is possibly one of the main reasons why the Civil War ultimately lasted 4 years, because you had this high sense of courage and this high sense of eagerness to defend what they're standing for on both sides, not just one side over the other, on both sides, that ultimately would just end up ending 4 years later, and as I mentioned before, with 600,000 lives being claimed. Both sides in the end were proven wrong, and the war lasted far longer than most Americans could have ever guessed. So who were the soldiers that made up the war? Pretty much soldiers came from every region of the country and from a variety of occupations. Most of them, however, came from farms. Almost half of the North's troops and more than 60% of the South's had owned or worked on farms. By the summer of 1861, this is now just a couple of months after the Battle of Fort Sumter and the eruption of the Civil War, the Confederate Army had about 112,000 soldiers. They were often called rebels. On the other hand, the Union had about 187,000 soldiers, and they called themselves Yankees. So the Yankees, and now you can probably guess where that name comes from for the baseball team. Yankees occupied the North, that is the Union territory. The rebels, the Confederates, occupied the South. And you have here in this little key, here are the border states along that 3630 line in between the Union and the Confederacy. By the end of the war, about 900,000 men had fought for the Confederacy, and a whopping 2.1 million men for the Union. The Union Army included just under 200,000 African Americans. In addition to that, there were actually about 10,000 Mexican Americans who also served in the war. Were they predominantly Yankees or rebels? Those are statistics that, unfortunately, I just don't have for you today. So again, here's a little study slide on who went to war, a little information about occupations, their ages. Moving on. I want to take the next couple slides to talk a little bit about some Army terms as far as how armies are organized. A lot of terms you've probably very familiar. Starting off with the soldier. Soldier is the building block of an army. During the Civil War, the Union more than 2 million soldiers, while the Confederate Army had less than that, half that number. In the Civil War, an Army Corps was the largest military formation, made up of 2 to 7 divisions. A division was made up of 2 or more brigades. In this painting, a brigade charges into battle. This is what's called a brigade. This photo shows a flag or the colors of the 1st West Virginia Veteran Infantry. The soldiers in this regiment fought in many battles over the course of the Civil War, as the list on their special flag indicates. A regiment usually had 1,100 men and officers. Regiments were comprised of 10 companies, and each company had 2 or 3 platoons in it. Civil War platoons were small military units with about 51 people in them. 50 soldiers and 1 officer, which was a corporal or a sergeant. Platoons were organized into even smaller units called squads. This photo shows Civil War officers for those platoons posing for the camera. So, in the life of a soldier, soldiers of the North and the South described what they saw and how they felt in several letters to family members and friends. A lot of these letters are actually still accessible, and you can actually read a lot of them on the internet. If you go onto the National Archives website on archives.gov, there's actually an abundance of letters that you can read from both soldiers from the North and the South. In many of those letters, many wrote about their boredom, they wrote about discomfort, they also wrote about the sickness, fear, and horror of being in the midst of this war. Most of the time, the soldiers lived in camps. Camp life did have its pleasant moments of songs, stories, letters from home, baseball games. At other times, a soldier's life was a very dull routine of drills, bad food, marches, and rain. Between battles, soldiers on both sides sometimes forgot they were even enemies. A private went ahead and famously described his wartime experiences. He put, "A part of Company K and some of the enemy came together and stacked arms and talked for a long time. Our men cooked coffee and treated them, and afterward each one took up his position again, and they began to fire at each other again, but not as hard as before. So these men on both sides firing at each other, pretty much killing each other, realizing at some point or another that they're forgetting that they're even enemies, and at some point or another they come together for a time of peace. And that same way there's a time for peace, there's a time for war. This is an excerpt from a piece titled "The Life of Billy Yank." So here's a little graphic for you showing how much soldiers in the Army made monthly. Starting off with the Civil War, you can see that privates, one of the more basic rankings in the military, made about $13 in the Civil War. And even the highest ranking, Sergeant Major, made no more than $21 in the Civil War. Of course, currency and economics change over the years. By 1942, these numbers pretty much triple, quadruple even, all the way up between $50 to $138. In Vietnam in 65, between $85 and $486. And then most recently in the Iraq War, anywhere between $1,200 monthly to about $4,100 monthly for a sergeant major. Looking at African Americans in the Civil War, this is why there's a star there. African Americans are not going to be able to serve in a rank higher than private, and even as a private, African Americans in the Civil War were paid only $7 a month. Definitely not a lot of money, especially when the prices of items look like this. Okay, these are the prices for items during the Civil War. Almost similar to some of the prices you might see in some stores today. But you can go ahead and do the math. These numbers do not add up, especially when we find out that Civil War soldiers actually had to replace any of the clothing that they lost out of their own pay. So if you were a sergeant major in the Civil War, let's say, and you made $21 in 1 month, look at how little that can buy you. I mean, you start to add up some of these items, and quickly you'll see that those $21 unfortunately are spent. The horrors of war. Despite those fleeting moments of calmness between both sides, the reality of war was always close by. Thousands of casualties overwhelmed medical facilities. After the famous Battle of Shiloh, the wounded lay in the rain for more than 24 hours waiting for treatment. A soldier recalled in a short quote, he put, "Many had died there, and others were in the last agonies as we passed. Their groans and cries were heartrending." In the face of these terrible realities, many men deserted. About 1 in every 11 Union soldier and about 1 in every 8 Confederate ran away because of fear, hunger, or sickness. A little bit about the casualties in the Civil War. As we mentioned at the start of this lesson, yeah, roughly 600,000. But what does that number mean? It's a lot bigger than you can imagine. The casualties in the Civil War were greater than the nation's losses in all American wars combined, from the American Revolution all the way through Vietnam in the 60s. Photographer Matthew Brady and his associates are famous for having captured scenes of some of those losses. Here, wounded soldiers lie under trees in Fredericksburg after the Battle of Spotsylvania in 1864. And you can see again some of those men lying there in several areas around the picture. Here in this actual photograph, wounded soldiers are crowded into a makeshift hospital. Many soldiers receive medical attention on the battlefields, but hospitals for treating the wounded all sprang up in many unlikely places. Even what is now the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., even that gallery became a hospital during the Civil War. Confederate soldiers in this picture lie dead in trenches behind a stone wall at Fredericksburg in Virginia. Soldiers used stone walls as protection from enemy fire. Over the walls, while remaining mostly hidden behind them, they could hide. Although soldiers still died behind the walls as shown in this image, the walls did prove to be a defensive advantage at times. Concluding this section and this lesson with a CompCheck question: how did the expectations of the war compare with the reality for both sides? I'm going to give you just a second because this video is already coming up on 35 minutes. Both sides did expect the war to end quickly, and many soldiers enlisted out of a sense of adventure. In reality, the war lasted longer than anyone had expected, and many soldiers deserted out of fear, hunger, and sickness. And that wraps up Chapter 17, Lesson 1. So, as mentioned before, you have a set of comprehension questions to answer on this lesson that I'm going to go ahead and pose now. So, write these questions down, take a screenshot of them. These need to be submitted by Thursday of this week. If you're watching this video a little too late, that is Thursday, May 14th. So, here is your homework. Okay? Question 1. Use these words in sentences about the Civil War that show me that you understand not just the terms, but the Civil War. So use them in sentence examples describing the Civil War. The words are border state and enlist. Number 2. How was the North's strategy different from the South's? Number 3, compare and contrast the attitudes in the Union and the Confederacy about enlisting African American soldiers. And number 4, what was the goal of the Anaconda Plan? That concludes Chapter 17, Lesson 1. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll be posting videos, hopefully, for Lessons 2 and 3 by next week, so that way we can do Lessons 4 and 5 by the week after that and be able to conclude Civil War just in time for the end of the 4th quarter and the end of your 8th grade year. Guys, again, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to send me a message on Classcraft. And as usual, hit that like button at the bottom of this video and be sure to subscribe to my channel. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day. Adios.